working together in various missions, and it becomes much more self-consciously a British movement. Again, after the Napoleonic Wars.
In the African context, is there any evidence of colonized peoples accepting the evangelical experience? And if so, have studies been done as to the degree? Because I know in Canada, for example, a lot of studies have been done about synchronicity and evangelical Christianity being very successful among a very small minority. Or do the sources exist?
Oh no, that's. I feel a little reticent to comment because it's such a big topic. Yes, Christianity is very largely taken up in many African societies. Mm-hmm. I think it becomes out of the control of missionaries. That there's a very important a multiplicity of important African independent church movement within mission denominations. Important movements by the even as early as 1850s and 60s to develop black churches or to resist white domination, but then there are also mission churches that remain quote unquote mixed. So yeah, history of Christianity in Africa is hugely important, absolutely hugely important, and it becomes embedded and taken over and becomes an African form. And I think it's probably more African Christians today than European Christians, probably. So this is a very important issue in the history of Africa more generally. But I think in the bit that I've studied, missionaries tend to lose control of the process quite quickly.
That sounds right.
Can I ask a question about the Canadian context? Are you doing anything with Peter Jones?
That's what I was thinking.
He and Joseph Brand are so close.
Yes, yeah.
They use the language of family. When the creditor kind of kicked off the Mississauga, the credit reserve, they go to land given them. But he really seems to have had this extraordinarily powerful vision, political, religious vision, convert to Methodism, and he realizes that he can use this as a lever to transform his people's political fortunes. If he can convince the people to be Methodist, then they take up agriculture, they give up alcohol, and ipso facto they are civilized and they have all the rights of the British subject, including complete land, like he's got this, it's all there, the whole package is there, and he's really zealous and really successful. And I'm not quite sure why it fails, and I'm not sure if it's the Methodism. At some points, crucial points, the Anglicans stand up and say, convert or we'll never give you secure tenure. At another moment, his interracial marriage, the Methodists seem to turn on him. There's such a complicated picture, but I was really amazed at how powerfully he saw it and ran with it and how far he got. Is that coming in at all? Is that a fair assessment of him or no?
Yes, that sounds right to me. I'll say, with everything I'm saying, I just take for granted I feel a little reticent about commenting on things I don't necessarily know enough about. But my sense, now that I never start most academics, my sense is that there's intense debate in Anishinaabe and in Haudenosaunee communities in the early 19th century about how best to adjust, to incorporate, even take advantage of a variety of political forms, changing economy and Christianity. I think Jones is actually very representative of one strand of people who do think that, who become very passionately interested in Methodism and see it as a tool. But it's competing with, I think, Anglican, like a view of Anglicanism was kind of at this point corrupt and not helpful. So there's a lot of tension around between Anglicanism and Methodism, as far as I can understand it. And younger people who kind of turn to Methodism as a way to kick out some of the older problems with Anglicanism. And Joseph Brand himself is, who is a Mohawk Anglican, but also a military leader. He himself is probably not that zealous a Christian. He's very performative as an Anglican, and he translates biblical texts. But I'm not convinced that he's deeply religious in the sense that Peter Jones is.
Mm-hmm. But Peter Jones is an extremely successful preacher, right?
Yeah.
Like he gets conversions. He doesn't get everyone, as you say. There are tenants, but he seems to have communicated this vision quite powerfully to his local. From the early 1820s, the British are saying, "Wow, this is a village that we can use as a model." it's exemplary.
But I thought ultimately with Peter Jones that his lack of success was the fact that the natives that he was preaching to within his own village and even on a wider level were only willing to accept Christianity up to a certain extent, to where it was useful for them, and when it wasn't, they were not willing to abandon their basic beliefs. And I think this is always the main problem with conversion among natives. Not a problem for them, but a problem for the colonizers. And I think that's what happened to me. That's what happened in that case and in countless others that I've looked at.
There's some interesting scholarship that would suggest that Methodism could be understood as a revitalization movement in parallel with some of the prophetic movements that I've been talking about. So it shouldn't be set up as quite set up in a dichotomous way. So a lot of the same techniques and beliefs, and that it could be seen as an effort to strengthen the community from within in the face of considerable threat. But I think that there's a constant colonial refusal, actually, to allow indigenous groups in to political and economic systems, no matter how much they convert or attempt to do the right things. There's a lot of resistance from the other side, which certainly happens in South Africa, where converts get completely blocked out, again, from the economies or the political systems they're trying to break into.
Yeah, around the 1840s, you have social Darwinism and these other ideologies that are coming into Canada and really coming into play as to any kind of integration or...
Well, it seemed to me that there was a kind of openness and cosmopolitanness early on.
There was,
more
yes,
racialized.
there was
And
that.
would you say that they do become more racialized, or no? Do you think in Britain?
Okay, I used to do the hand waving, but
Sorry.
the hand waving, I'm venturing to lands, I don't know where I'm completely confident, but leaving that aside, I think that the settler state is becoming more racialized and is demanding difference, and that settlers themselves are trying to break down, erect very strong barriers between themselves and indigenous peoples. I think the same thing's happening in South Africa, which is why religion ceases to be a primary mode of identification and becomes replaced by race. It seems to me that in Canada, people who have mixed ancestry at this period are being forced to choose in a way that they didn't have to before. And
a bunch of things. One is that it's wonderful to have the project that I'm directing and Julie's part of, a number of people here are part of, ends about 100 years, 150 years earlier than you begin.
Sorry.
So it's wonderful because the story is a very large story. One of the things that comes to mind is that in a number of the narratives about conversion in the period that I study, the color of the African skin changes from black to white, since race is not so deeply embedded, and confessional identity can produce a physical change. And that's not what I wanted to ask you about. I wanted to ask you about the stories. In Dante's poem is a grand conversion narrative, okay, but it's also a conversion of Virgilian epic, a placing of Virgilian epic, a conversion of Virgilian epic into the imagery, the language, the figures into a Christian narrative. Is there evidence in the archive that you're dealing with that the stories are not only about conversion, but they're also stories that convert earlier stories?
I think that you could see maybe African reinvention of stories about family as reinserting Christianity. I don't think that's quite what you're asking. I think I can't think of a literary example, but missionaries in the Cape in the 1790s talk about converts who come and tell them that they have seen visions, or their parents had told them that there would be missionaries who came. So there's like a retrospective reinsertion, and they will say, I had a dream that I would be converted, or my father told me that one day you will, and I think that's a smoothing over. I think it might be consonant with ways of also telling ancestor stories, like stories about foundational figures who would be foundational for the group. So maybe Christianity gets reinserted as part of that genealogy. That's not, I know what you're asking, but that's what comes to my mind. difficult because the stories I'm talking about are so bitty and so individual. It's not kind of a great epic that's drawing off another great epic. But they're, I guess in an ultimate way, they're drawing from biblical accounts and looking back to St. Paul. So there's a sense in which there's a larger Christian narrative that people would see these as individual reflections of this larger biblical narrative.
I'd actually like to, get down to the level of vocabulary and sentence structure, things like that, and look at what's being sort of, where it's coming from and what's happening to it.
I'm sure you can trace it.
There is one example of St. Catherine with a Mohawk saint, which is essentially a conversion of a Mohawk experience into a Jesuit Latin experience, I think. That would be one example, I think.
Yeah, I was going to say Jesuit relations are absolutely packed with conversion stories. And a lot of the problems that you describe about, the community not wanting to, if somebody falls back and behaves badly, they don't want to. You don't think the Methodists were reading the Jesuit relations?
I think that a lot of this comes from Christian theology. So I would be astonished if you didn't find the same thing 200 years earlier. And yes, actually, they did read the Jesuit relations. They thought the Jesuits were damned, but they still read the Jesuit relations because they like to read accounts of missions. So they had these kind of collections of previous missions.
And the ones who were abolitionists do quite admire the Jesuits in Catholic Spain, Catholic France, because the Code Noir and all the slave laws were much more vigorous than Britain's missionary efforts and the Protestant laws. So there's a certain Catholic, Francophilia in there as well.
And actually, the Mohawk, I have the accounts, Oneida, telling this Presbyterian missionary that we really don't like Presbyterianism because you keep telling people that they're damned and you won't let people be, and we like the old religion by which they make Catholicism and Anglicanism. And they were arguing that they wanted to remain Anglicans because Anglicans didn't bother you with talking about sin. Anglicans just baptized you and let you get on with things, just like the Jesuits. So they have this kind of discussion of the Jesuits that gets brought into this oral memory.
Virginia.
Oh yeah, I was thinking too of Les Carpeau's accounts and some of the sort of early 17th century accounts, which tend to focus more on acts. Like they tend to focus more on the raising of the cross, or sort of like a scene. And I'm wondering if there's a way of maybe looking at the notion of perhaps a performativity or the power of something like confession and its implantment in relationship to the kind of public enunciation and the printed word as different forms of implantment with different productions going on. It's a very much.
So you think of the written text as a kind of performance in itself.
Certainly, but whether this notion of the emotional compact or of the does that describe states and conditions more than it describes one's own acts and thoughts? I'm not sure, versus confession, where you maybe recount something that you've done in a more intimate sphere. How does the scale change?
I think in some ways that talking about emotional contract is maybe a little bit out of step with what the other stuff I was saying. So I'm not, because it's an unconscious contract. It's not the same emotion, a deliberate unconscious set of emotional exchanges. So I'd say it's maybe in some ways the unspoken contract that undergirds the much more formal, organized way of thinking about an emotional exchange. And I think Protestants, on one level, claim that they are not as oriented to acts as Catholics. So they will criticize Catholic missionaries for putting up crosses or baptizing people in an indiscriminate manner. And they argue that Protestants, on the contrary, are looking for real individual changes of the heart, and that even the acts in themselves are not enough. You need to have this experience of God, and that you need to be told that by a comment. So they've got, I think, on the one hand, a language that seems quite different, and then in reality, I think they're actually much closer. And they do, in fact, look for the performance of particular things. So to stake out mission station is a performance. To have people tell a religious conversion is in itself a kind of statement of allegiance, regardless of the content of it. So again, I think there's a real disjuncture between a theoretical framework and maybe some other things that are going on at the same time.
Which interesting.
Lee.
the more common these narratives become, the more common the conversion experiences become, and the more often they're told, the more often they're printed, the more potential there is for them to become formulaic.
Yes,
right?
absolutely, yes.
So there must have been at least a kind of ripple of suspicion of some of them that people are following a common plot or retelling someone else's story, changing names and places and that
Yes.
sort of thing. So was there a test for genuineness, or was the more common these experiences become, the easier they are to fake, is what I mean, right?
Yes,
If the
that's
process of
absolutely
conversion or this kind of evangelical conversion experience becomes a kind of socialization, that there's another kind of reason to want to have it, right? To have this
Yes.
experience. So, what I guess it's good. It's a simple question, I guess, but what is there in the evidence of people being suspicious of other people's experiences or trying to test?
Great question. I think quite suspicious most of the time.
Okay.
Actually, missionaries are always worried because they can't tell if somebody's really converted or not. Because again, it's not like Catholicism where if we do an act, so they always say, well, we had so-and-so in and we grilled him and we tried to figure out if he really meant it, and we think he did, but we're not sure. And also converts themselves seem to be racked sometimes by self-doubt. And in diaries, people will talk about, well, I thought I was converted, but today I'm not sure. Maybe I have to do it again. So it's a constant state of a lack of clarity, because the certainty comes from an emotion, and that emotion isn't visible to an outside person. And it's also, even people themselves are constantly doubting their own emotions, like whether they had a real emotion.
It is a very personal experience, and you're right, only the converted person can genuinely, if they trust their own conversion experience, can know that they are converted, but...
Unless your trust is a sign of your sinfulness because you're being proud.
Right. But in this context, it has to be performed in some way. Someone else has to witness it.
Yeah.
If a tree converts in the forest, so that's why they're being published in these journals, right?
Yeah.
So in the narratives that you started with, the published kind of, my impression is that they're sort of potted narratives, or perhaps they're much longer than I'm imagining them to be. Are these the ones that have passed the test? Are people reading them with suspicion?
They're the ones that have passed the test because they've been presented as examples.
Okay.
I think.
Okay.
Although I'm
And then
interested.
they also become examples to model, right?
Yes, exactly. So the example is out there, so people know what they're supposed to do. So if you have to go to a church and claim membership, so you can take communion, you have to tell your conversion story. It seems to me that people are applying to their own lives this set of stereotypes,
Right.
and which I think is also really interesting. Both sometimes genuinely believing them, but also trying to make their lives fit. Missionaries tried to have, and also those who were employing missionaries and missionaries in the field, they would have interviews. So a missionary would have to send in a spiritual account, a would-be missionary would send in a spiritual account, and then he would be called in and he would be grilled by the candidates examination committee, and they would go through his account and try to figure out if it was real.
Okay.
And
And
then-
the interesting thing that's happening, whether it's this intensely personal experience somebody has, ostensibly an experience directly with God, is not legitimate unless someone else.
Yes, which I think is extremely interesting. And even though it's billed as this completely personal experience, which has nothing to do with anybody else,
Right.
it becomes this communal. And missionary societies will also pull in any women that the missionary wishes to marry, and then they will have those women tell them their conversion story, and if they're not satisfied with the woman's conversion story, then they will say, you can't get married to this woman. And sometimes missionaries will not go out because their fiancé's conversion stories haven't been believed. So it is a really weird process. I mean, it's very bureaucratic for an ecstatic religious experience.
Right.
I just had a question that somewhat builds out of that one in terms of, I was wondering that if you could provide a little more context to the first part of your talk about specifically the domestic story of these conversion narratives as they're found in the research you did in this particular journal. I was wondering if you could place that journal, which, I mean, from the sound of it, is heavily steeped in Calvinist theology. When you talk, for example, the evidences of grace, right, being one of the 5 pillars of Calvinism, things like total depravity that you mentioned at the beginning of the talk. My question is, do you find, or is there any evidence that you're aware of significant or interesting differences between this kind of Calvinist culture of conversion narrative with Armenian ones
Yes,
or
yes.
Anabaptist ones, and whether there's a difference
Yes.
there, particularly as we talked, as was a lot spoken of, much spoken of in the second part of the talk about the difference between denominations and how they approach conversion stories, obviously in a colonial context. Within the domestic context, what are the differences and what are some
That's
narratives?
a really important, great question. This is indeed a Calvinist publication, and it's been put out by self-consciously Calvinist people who are seeing themselves interdenominational, but they're defined by common Calvinism. And they would be coming out of painful conflicts with Armenians. These guys would not have seen Armenians as truly converted because they feel that they're putting an excessive trust in works. So, on the one hand, there's I think a conflict in the late 18th century around what it really takes to be converted. But that shifts in the early 19th century as I think there's a rapprochement between Calvinism and Calvinism and Armenianism, and a sense that this was a conflict that maybe wasn't worth it. So my sense is that Calvinists actually become softer, and they become, at least in a British context. Boyd Holm has actually done some really interesting work about this, that it becomes harder for people to think of themselves and their children and all their friends and relations as dad. There's kind of this shift towards a softer Calvinism that I think takes on board some of the ideas, well, if you're behaving well, you probably are safe. So missionaries in the field are coming from different perspectives, and you're absolutely right. And I'm actually oversimplifying hugely. If I'm being, no, it's true. If I'm being honest, because this is one genre, and that there are other genres. So missions, actually, I would say probably Victorian missions, to go back to Matt's questions, become less kind of rabidly Calvinist, and more oriented to signs of salvation, and those signs of salvation increasingly start to look like behaving in a civilized way.
Just building off of that previous comment, given that these narratives are being published in a time of, rabid Calvinism, it's interesting that there is a debate, there is a bit of suspicion about the evidences of grace being a fundamental tenet of Calvinism. And I found it very interesting in terms of that is a big problem with these narratives, and as you say, the potentiality for reproduction and even potential forgery of these accounts. And how, given that this is coming from a denomination which places great emphasis on the fruits of the Spirit, the evidences of grace, that there is such potential there for suspicion of or questioning of,
and the suspicion of even of the remainder of the missionary movement. There's also resurgences of more evangelical missions. 19th century that would then question whether all this other conversion is real conversion.
I think we have time for perhaps one more question. Yes?
I have a quick question about, hope it's quick, about the idea of communities and emotions, because that's what I was really interested in, the idea that you have the creation of a community collected around this idea of an emotion of pity or sympathy or totality, this feeling that they are united because they feel the same way. And one of the differences I think you have between the European conversion and why the Mohawks, for instance, are adopting this, they don't want to feel the same way as settlers or the missionaries. Is there any sense of what kind of emotion they are experiencing in this conversion, or is there a different emotional community which we see in a colonial context that disrupts the idea of a conversion?
I think that speaks to a really complicated question of cultural ideas about what emotion would be appropriate or how to express emotion, which I think is somewhat contingent. So I think there's a British assumption here that conversion will produce emotions, and then you will create a community of emotion. I think it's possible that there are different cultural expectations about what emotion you could display, or what would be an appropriate way to display emotion, possibly in maybe in a Mohawk community. And I really don't want to overgeneralize, but it would be seen as, I think, excessive and inappropriate to have a kind of extremely physical, emotional, rolling on the ground, holy roller conversion experience, which is something that might make sense in a British context, and in other contexts that might make more sense. So I think we need to be careful about not assuming that cultural expectations about displaying emotion are the same in different societies. But having said that, my sense is that that religious activity is designed to produce an emotion, and that emotion in part comes from a sense of community solidarity in a number of colonial contexts. So and that emotion of solidarity is one that could be threatened by individualistic and oriented accounts of conversions as a real paradox. Am I answering your question? No.
Yes.
Okay.
I want to know actually, is there an indigenous emotion which is being expressed in not to say altogether, but is there? Can you see something in a Mohawk experience where they're talking about this is the emotion I felt in my conversion, which doesn't translate for European missionary, or is there an example, or is there an emotion which Salt Lake City, or which to the Khoikhoi, the big deal?
The trouble with Mohawk accounts is I actually don't have written accounts by people saying I've had a conversion experience. I have accounts by people saying we would appreciate a Mohawk teacher to teach our children, or please translate these prayer books, or please send us a missionary to baptize our children. There's a lot of, or alternatively, Brad writing about translating the gospel, but it's always in the context of we are already Christian and we would like some other stuff. And I am torn. There's three possible explanations, well, maybe more, but one is the sources are not there because these are very limited sources. Another is it wasn't encouraged as a way of, or expected. And these are Anglicans who do not demanding conversion narratives. They really are thinking that ritual is efficacious and baptism is efficacious and saying prayers is efficacious, and you don't need to have a conversion experience, so maybe it's not being called for. Or another explanation might be that quite genuinely this was a less emotional experience, and maybe those indigenous groups that did convert to Methodism, maybe or to other more evangelical ecstatic movements, maybe were more committed. I mean, I don't know. I really don't know. There's just a kind of barrier in the sources, and also people have people writing about alliance with the British, but they're not talking about this is my personal religious emotion. That's just something that's not in the sources, and it's really interesting to me that it's not in the sources, because in the sources about the Khoikhoi in South Africa it is everywhere.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. That was really great.
Thank you so much.